And listening. Today I'm speaking with Zach Lane, the co-founder of Wonder, a Socratic-based school system, K-12, in Wichita, Kansas. It's a follow-up to a discussion I had with Jeff Sandifer, who's an innovator on the educational front for K-12. And I wanted to talk to Zach today about the details of the educational process so that parents and other people interested in childhood education could understand more thoroughly the mechanics of the process. First of all, I have holes in my memory, because I was ill for a while, and I don't remember how we met. We met through Jeff, eh?
Actually, it was the opposite.
Oh, okay.
It was, I was working in education and became a listener to a lot of what you were doing and a follower in some ways. And then you had explained how you had so much interest in revolutionizing education in various different ways. And so with that, I reached out to you. I sent a cold email to you and we met Father's Day, maybe 2018 in Minneapolis. And we sat down and we talked about education. And from there, it sort of spurred into this, hey, we're very aligned. We have similar interests and we're wanting to see similar change. And from that, then introduced you to Jeff, and we started kind of working with the Acton MBA, the Acton Academy, and that's how it all started.
I see. Now, so you're deeply involved in educational transformation.
Yeah.
You have a school, and you're going to be taking over the Acton program at some point in the future.
Well, we're taking a leadership role in the Acton program,
Yeah.
for sure. Our school, we have an independent, decentralized network, is what I would say, of schools. And our school is called Wonder.
Okay, and who's we?
So I would say, well, my wife and I co-founded our school. And so that's when I say we, that's usually who I'm talking about. Well, we founded Wonder. And the process for me was, Acton wasn't actually the first place I looked. This whole thing started for me out of necessity. And the reason was, when I was a young kid, I didn't fit in the box. I had too much energy. I was probably too enterprising. My parents and principal didn't know what to do with me. I can remember a parent-teacher conference when my principal, who was a teacher at the time, told my parents, if I was ever stuck on a desert island, I'd want to be with Zach because he'd find a way off. But that wasn't necessarily a good thing. It was sort of like, how do we solve that problem? And so when my first son was born, I had a call from an uncle, and he said to me, hey, congratulations, I was still at the hospital. And as a joke, he said, well, now you need to start thinking about schools. And I'd spent my entire life trying to get out of school, basically just wanting to be done with education, get into the world, get into business or whatever it might be. And when he said that, it was one of those times that something strikes you. And that struck me, and I hadn't thought about it. And so that kicked off what was about a 5 or 6 year journey, which was traveling the country, visiting schools. I probably visited over 70 schools around the country and in other countries as well. And one of those was Acton Academy. And so that's how I got connected there. And
so what did you see when you went and saw all these schools?
So mostly it was this. There was varying flavors or the attempt to put a different screen over what was essentially the same model. Almost all of them were the same direct instruction model that we see. Teacher at the front of the classroom, lecturing to students in desks all day, and days broken up by periods. Now, some were working more in vocational skills. There's some that were like helping young people, learn the trades and things like that. Great. Others were quite innovative. There's some, we worked with a school on the campus of MIT that was for middle school, high schoolers. That was quite innovative. They were very hands-on, very project-oriented, very project-driven. But what I noticed is that it was still something that was ultimately led by adults. And so that seemed to be the trend everywhere I went, no matter how innovative the school was.
So the basic model that you perceived was teacher in the front of the room, rows of desks, regimented periods,
Yep.
the children as absorbing knowledge, essentially. Knowledge is something delivered as factual.
Yep.
You saw a lot of variations on that, but no fundamental transformation.
Oh, yeah. And variations on that, also variations on socioeconomic status within the school. That was something, because when many people think about school, they think public and private. What they don't understand is 99% of those schools operate the exact same way, just what you described. one teacher at the front of the classroom and students listening, trying to absorb, taking notes, and not being necessarily engaged in hands-on learning or taking ownership over their own learning.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting model. It's an interesting epistemological model because it presumes that the most appropriate knowledge, the most necessary form of knowledge that children will gain is factual and descriptive, right? That it's semantic, it can be transmitted through words, that it's memorization predicated, that it comes from a central authority, that the children should be socialized to sit immobile, essentially, and listen passively rather than actively, that they should do that in a group, that they should be regimented in time, right? So you might say, contrary to that, well, children should be actively engaged in exploring, they should be questioning, they should be moving around. There's no necessary reason for that regimentation. They should be developing their own vision. The enterprises could be project focused, and that education should be much more about the acquisition of skill rather than the acquisition of regurgitatable knowledge. And that's a few transformations that you might consider. And so, okay, but you said that while you were investigating all these schools, you came across the Acton Academy, and what made it stand out in your mind?
Well, it's all the things that you just mentioned are all what I would call, there's some about the process that you go through within the school, and much about the content that you're going to absorb in the school or that you're engaging with. What I think that we need to step back and look at is that when we're talking about different schools, what we look at is not so much the content, the academic content. Like, we know largely what young people should be engaged in as far as like the basics. Like, we know that. What we talk about is a system. And what I mean by this is, let me give you an anecdote. I've probably talked to over 1,000 parents at this point about our school, about what they want from education for their child. And one question I always ask is, what do you dream your child will be able to do when they're 18 or when they leave the house? And without exception, I do not get an academic answer. I do not get, I hope they can do complex math. I hope that they've mastered calculus. I hope that, I don't get academic answers. What I get, especially the younger the child is I hope they can go out into the world with courage. I hope they can know how to be,
right. Well, yeah,
work well with other
I
people.
didn't touch on in that list of alternatives was character development, moral character development, and motivation, right? And so, all right, so the parents have a vision that's more aligned with that. They want their child to be of good character, to be able to go out into the world forthrightly. And so what do you make of that when you hear parents tell you that?
Well, what I make of it is that almost all parents want that. However, when you try to marry the idea of the traditional school with what I would say parents are actually asking for is agency. They want their child to have agency over their life, which is having the power and resources to fulfill their potential, something like that. And so when I look at the traditional model, you look at, it's predicated on compliance. It's predicated on control, permission to speak, permission to move about, permission to work with others. What I say is those two things don't marry. You can't you can't put your child in a system like that and expect that they will fulfill this potential of agency within that, because those are some of the most formidable years of your life. You think 3 to 12, especially from the development of the brain, like, you're learning what system you're within and how to operate within that system. And Jordan, it's actually quite a conundrum for people, especially with conservative beliefs, because we say, hey, this is what we want. We talk about it at home. We talk about agency and freedom and responsibility. And yet we send our children to a school that doesn't advocate for any of those.
Yeah, well, I did some background research into the origin of the public school system, partly because I developed these programs, the self-authoring programs, and one of them is an exercise that helps people develop a vision for the future. And I implemented that with my university students first. And so it asks them to imagine their lives 5 years down the road. If they could have what they needed and wanted, assuming they were taking care of themselves properly, what might their life look like? They write about that for 15 minutes, and then they write about the hell they could produce around themselves in 5 years if they let their bad habits take the upper hand. And then they go through 7 major domains of their life and write out a vision and a strategy for that. So it's intimate relationship and family, friendship, career, resistance to temptations like alcohol and drug abuse, use of time outside of work, let's say productive and generous use of time outside of work, and care of themselves physically and mentally. We're going to add civic responsibility to that list. And so it's an attempt to help people derive, create a differentiated vision of what their life could be like and who they could be, and also to conceptualize themselves as the sort of person who can derive a vision. And I used that in my classes for years, and I conducted 3 research studies using that program, and we showed that if you had students do that exercise for 90 minutes in their orientation session before they went to trade school, they were 50% less likely to drop out, which is like an absolutely staggering result. And their grade point averages of students already enrolled went up 35%, right? Which is crazy, right? For 90 minutes. But the crazy thing, really crazy thing was, as far as I was concerned, and it took me probably a year or two of thinking to really notice this, was that, well, this isn't rocket surgery, as a ridiculous Canadian comedian would put it, right? Of course, people should have a vision for their life. You talked about character development, moral developments, like, well, that's what parents want for their children. We would like our children, we would like those we love to be active, engaged, moral agents, aiming upward. And yet, we do nothing whatsoever in the school system to foster that, ever, even once, even for one day. So my students, despite having gone through 14 years of education and being top of the class, all things considered, because the University of Toronto was a fairly selective school, no one had ever asked them to do an exercise like that. And that, the more I thought about that, the more I was dumbfounded by it. And then I did some investigation into the derivation of the North American, European, for that matter, public education system, and found out that it was based on the Prussian model. Mm-hmm. And the Prussians produced a universal education system in the late 1800s because they were afraid they were losing military superiority, and they wanted to produce a cadre of mindless, obedient soldiers. Mm-hmm. That was expressly the purpose. And then that model was adopted by prototypical fascists in the US, again in the late 1800s. This is before Mussolini and all of that time. Corporate types mostly, who wanted to produce cadres of obedient workers. And that's why the desks are in rows, and that's why there's factory bells, and that's why it's top-down leadership. But what was really stunning about that wasn't only that that was the model, but it's worse than that, because the people who built the schools were consciously aiming at eradicating the will of the students who were part of the system, because they wanted them to be obedient. Now, there was a demand for factory workers at the time, and there were a lot of rural people flooding into the cities, and no one really knew what to do with the kids because they didn't have farm work. And there was some need for an education system, and there was some utility in producing people who knew how to abide by a clock and who could therefore take on factory jobs. But that as a model, especially now in the modern world where things change so quickly that you can hardly keep up and people have to be dynamic, and that sort of 9-to-5 lifetime factory work is maybe, well, it's a dream of the past in some ways, even though it might not have been that desirable to begin with. It certainly has nothing to do with the way people live now. But, well, the education system hasn't changed, except perhaps for the worst, in 150 years. It's just, it's absolutely jaw-dropping, that the fact that this is all the case. Okay, so you saw in the Acton schools, you saw a completely different model. And walk us through that. Like, I don't even understand what a school day would look like in a decentralized system. I went to London, I saw Kate Birbelsing's school, the Michaela School, and she's taken that teacher dominant, let's say, teacher authority, student listening model to its ultimate degree. I mean, she's very, very good at it. The teachers are handing out information at a rate that's absolutely staggering, and the kids are awake and listening. Although they're responding a lot, they have an opportunity to talk to each other that's structured, and they do a lot of responses to the teachers, so they're really engaged. And I can see that a model like that can work, right? There may be a variety of models that would work for kids, but your model is very different. And so